Welcome to session 10 of the course on the early emperors. This week we will talk about the year of the 4 emperors. Here they are, various paintings of those emperors. On the left you have Galba. Immediately to the right of him you have Otho. To the right of him you have Vitalius. And on the far right you have Vespasian, the great winner of the year of 4 emperors, the last of the 4 emperors, and the one who turned out to be the only and by far the most conspicuous success. With the possible exception of Vitalius, and one very stout man looked very like any other very stout man, I wouldn't say that these look particularly like those emperors, but they are rather nice paintings, so I put them in. Let's begin with the end of Nero. By 68 AD, let's take a rather generous view of when the empire begins. Let's take 30 BC as the beginning of the empire, although you could go back and say that the empire actually started in the sense that the republic had collapsed in 48 BC, but let's take 30. 30 plus 68 minus 1, that's 97 years, isn't it? Let's say 100 years. By the last year of Nero, the empire has existed for about 100 years. It has existed for at least 97 years, and it may well have existed for pushing towards 115 years. There is no one alive who remembers the Republic as a set of functioning sovereign institutions for the Roman state and the Roman people. There is no one alive who has spoken to anyone who remembers the Republic as a going concern. The Republic is as far back in history. For Romans in the year 68 AD, the Republic is as remote as the funeral of Queen Victoria is for us. Indeed, the Republic is a great deal more remote because there are so many things that tie us to the later Victorians. First of all, there is the fact that we do tend to live a great deal longer than the Romans did. On average, it seems that we live twice as long as the Romans did. You then have the fact that we have a mountain of photographs, films, sound recordings, and what have you, which tie us to the more or less distant past now. And then you just have the greater density of historical information that we have. If you want something comparable, if you want to name a time that is comparably distant for us, as far as Romans in AD 68 were concerned, the Republic was almost as distant from them as the French Revolution is for us. It takes you back to an entirely different state of society, an entirely different world, and the Republic has been swept away. However, although the Republic no longer exists, its ghost still has an enormous and a troublesome effect on the governing institutions of the new Roman Empire. These troubles can be kept in reserve for a long time because the empire is ruled by a single family. You've had Augustus, whose relationship to Tiberius was somewhat tenuous, but there was an adoptive link, and that's good enough for the Romans. And between Tiberius and Caligula there is a closer relationship, and between Caligula and Claudius there's a closer relationship, and between Claudius and Nero there is a reasonable blood relationship. So the empire has been ruled by a single family, which gives a certain unity to it and even a certain stability. But the last years of Nero are difficult. They're difficult because whether or not you care to believe everything that is written about Nero in Sutonius and Tacitus the various Christian historians, and of course much later in Dio Cassius. There is no reasonable doubt that Nero became increasingly paranoid in his later years. He may have been paranoid with very good reason. It may be that there were people out to get him. His building projects were expensive, and beyond that you have the enormous cost of fighting the Jewish war. And remember, the Jewish war was not simply a matter of prestige. It was not the equivalent of fighting the Boer War for us. You see, as long as we held on to Cape Town, it didn't really matter if Transvaal and Natal were British possessions or independent Dutch settlements. It didn't make much difference to us one way or the other. For the Romans, holding on to the Jewish areas of the Middle East, holding on to Palestine, was not simply a matter of prestige, of telling the world, look, we're the Romans, we're on top and we're going to stay that way. It was a matter of existential importance because, as I said weeks ago, if the Jews had managed to secure any degree of independence from Rome, they would almost certainly have entered into closest relationships with the Parthians. The Parthians would have been pushing for a relationship, and an independent Jewish state would have found it irresistible to play the Romans and the Parthians off against each other, and there would have been the possibility of a powerful and hostile rival with a presence on the Mediterranean, something the Romans had not experienced since the days of the Second Punic War. And so when the Jews rose in revolt in 66, there was no alternative but to pour all military resources available into the reconquest of this area and to spend whatever it cost. And was Nero up to directing this war of reconquest? Arguably not. Indeed, it may be arguable that Nero's carelessness with the apportionment of taxes had more than contributed to the outbreak of this war. So by 68, you have Nero as a paranoid and probable tyrant. You have an existential war at the eastern fringe of the Mediterranean, a war which is of enormous importance for the survival of the empire, not just its prestige, but its very survival. And you have a general feeling in at least the governing class that Nero is not up to the job. The problem is that what do you do about it? There is no one else in the family who is ready to take over. Everybody else is dead. Quite often they've been murdered by Nero himself, but everybody else who might conceivably take over is dead. Here is the family tree of the Julian-Claudian house. It carries us down to the time of Nero. Of course, there are relatives, there are descendants of most of these characters, and they continue to be mentioned occasionally well into the 2nd century. There are descendants of Augustus drifting around right up until nearly the end of the 2nd century, but eligible replacements for Nero, people who would step into Nero's shoes with immediate legitimacy. No, you don't have that. And yet Nero himself is widely perceived as not up to the job. You have the potential for political instability and also the potential for a crisis of legitimacy within the imperial system as a whole. Remember that the empire is in theory a state of emergency. Back in the 20s BC, Augustus had restored the Republic. There was no dictatorship for life. The Republic was restored. It's just that Augustus was immediately granted a bundle of powers that amounted to supreme authority. But as soon as Augustus died, those powers lapsed and the Republic was restored in full. It's just that those powers were then granted to Tiberius, and so it goes on. There was no continuing empire. The empire was always a state of emergency declared at the beginning of a reign. And what happened if a reign was brought to a violent or at least an irregular end, as happened in the case of Nero? Nero committed suicide. There's some confusion over the exact sequence of events. The Senate declared him a public enemy and called on him to stand trial before the Senate. Nero then committed suicide, but the Senate had already decided that perhaps they should simply open negotiations with him. But whatever the case, Nero has been deprived of imperial power and he's now dead. So what is going to happen next? There's no one left in the Julio-Claudian family who can be put into his shoes. There's no Claudius lurking behind a curtain to be pulled out to have the imperial robe wrapped about him. No, there's nobody. What has happened is that early in 68 AD, Gaius Julius Vindex, not an aristocrat, a rather low-born person who's made it to governor of part of Gaul, he's announced a revolt against Nero, and he's looked around for an alternative emperor to support. It seems that Vindex sent letters to a large number of people saying, I'm about to rise in revolt against Nero because he's useless. Would you like me to support you as emperor? And most people wrote back saying no thank you, or they simply gave the letters to Nero saying, I think you should look at this. One person in April 68, Servius Sulpicius Galba, the governor of the largest Spanish province, he accepts the offer. He is then acclaimed emperor by his soldiers in Cartagena, or New Carthage, which means that this is something that becomes very common, particularly in the 3rd century, that a governor or a general is acclaimed emperor by his troops, and then he has to make good his claim, or if he can't make good his claim, he dies. He's killed. This is the first time this has happened. Now, the Vindex revolt falls apart very quickly. The problem is that Vindex has a large army of Gallic irregulars. These are provincials. They are not seen yet as entirely Roman because Gaul has not yet been fully Romanized. The Roman armies on the Rhine despise these Gallic auxiliaries. There's a quick battle and that's it. Vindex is defeated by a man called Virginius Rufus, who dies in the reign of, he dies in the reign of Trajan. He lives a very long life. And although Rufus is offered the empire by his soldiers, he refuses it and puts down the Vindex revolt. Vindex commits suicide. That appears to be the end of it. It's just that Galba has now declared himself emperor, and once you've done that, there's no choice but to press on. And Galba is supported in Rome by a number of important people. One of his most important supporters is a man called Nymphidius Sabinus, who is the deputy prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He persuades the soldiers, if you support Galba, he will give you 30,000 sesterces as a reward, which is equivalent to about 10 years of their salary. So the Praetorian Guard switches sides, and increasing numbers of men in the Senate declare for Galba, until eventually in June 68, the Senate declares Nero an enemy of the state and scares him into suicide. And then, what next? That's the end of the Julio-Claudian house. Well, what do you do next? The empire has been running for over 100 years. The Republic no longer exists. It exists on paper, and every so often it is restored on paper. when an emperor dies or is deposed, but no one believes the Republic can be restored. It's silly. It's rather as if a French Conservative Party were to suggest that the descendants of Louis XVI should be invited back to take the crown with exactly the same constitutional arrangements as were disrupted in 1789. It is something that is legally possible, but nobody seriously believes that it will happen or that it could be made to work. But Nero's dead. The imperial family is extinct. The imperial office must be transferred to somebody else. The only person who appears to be available is Galba, and so the Senate appoints Galba as the emperor. But this is where the problems begin. Oh, here is a Russian painting from the 19th century showing the death of Nero. I suppose it must have looked something like that. There's the family tree, and as I keep on saying, do study this, it explains a lot. Let's have a look at Galba. This is a statue of him, this is a bust of him, and he seems to have looked something like this. He does have many things in his favour as an emperor. The first is that although he's not a close relative of the Julio-Claudians, and note my emphasis on close, he is born into an old and wealthy family. He is a member of the historic senatorial nobility. As such, he is of course related distantly to the imperial family. All of these people, all of these very rich aristocratic families that emerged in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC and which claim a descent further back into Roman history, but all of these families who dominated Rome in the late Republican period were related by intermarriage. So Galba is not an acknowledged member of the imperial family, but he is a member of the senatorial nobility, and as such he has some claim to rule. He can also claim a lifetime of imperial services by AD 68. He has filled a number of offices, and he's filled them all with great distinction. He is, however, 73. He is old. He's very old. He's very old by their standards, and he's rather elderly by our standards. An emperor is expected to do a lot of work, and Galba is old. Let's look at some of the descriptions of him. He was of average height, very bald, with blue eyes and a hooked nose. His hands and feet were so distorted by gout that he could not endure a shoe for long, unroll a book, or even hold one. The flesh on his right side, too, had grown out and hung down to such an extent that it could with difficulty be held in place by a bandage. So you have an old man in plainly poor health who has suddenly put himself up as emperor and by a set of unlikely circumstances become emperor. Here is one of the official representations of Galba, and I think we can be quite sure that he didn't look like that. Indeed, it doesn't look anything like Galba. Perhaps I should have another look at the provenance of that representation. No, Galba was bald, but never mind. So he's old, and reasonably speaking, nobody can expect him to last for very long. He is there to hold things together. He needs to appoint a successor. He has no children of his own. His children and his wife had died many years earlier, so what can he do? All he can do is to deal with the immediate crisis and appoint a successor who is acceptable to the Senate, and perhaps, though no one's talking about this at the moment, perhaps acceptable to the army or even just the Praetorian Guard. Eventually, Galba adopts a young man, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Licinianus. That's to be his successor, but, well, it doesn't last very long after that. But during the time that Piso is the adopted heir, many people do regard him as the effective emperor because Galba is increasingly incapacitated by age and illness and the strains of being an emperor. Even before he found the strains too great for him, it seems that Galba behaved in a somewhat impulsive, indeed an eccentric manner. As the new emperor, he began by putting to death various people in the Spanish provinces. On his way from Spain to Rome, passing through Gaul and northern Italy, he seems to have stopped off at every place and ordered more executions. As he approaches Rome, the man who's done most to put him on the throne, the deputy prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Nymphidius Sabinus, he realizes with horror that Galba will not appoint him the Praetorian prefect, so he won't get the promotion he's been looking for. He also realizes that Galba is not going to give the Praetorian Guard the 30,000 sesterces that he's promised. And so he tries to save himself by putting himself up as emperor. He announces to the Praetorian Guard that he is a bastard son of Caligula and that he should be the next emperor, but even as he's giving his speech, he's murdered by the Praetorian Guard. That means that Sabinus is out of the way, and it means that Galba is not bound to honour that promise of 30,000 sesterces to each of the men, or at least not in the short term. October 69, Galba at last arrives in Rome, and it is a most inauspicious entry. In his last days, Nero, short of actual foot soldiers, has recruited a legion from the navy. He's recruited a large number of sailors into a new legion. These people find themselves in a difficult position because they are not formally members of the Roman army. Indeed, their legal status is somewhat dubious. And so as Galba enters into Rome, as he passes over the Milvian Bridge, these soldiers, these auxiliaries, these recruits, press forward, hailing Galba as emperor and asking for their position to be regularized. Galba misunderstands what they're doing, and he orders a massacre of these people. Several thousand people are killed in the fighting. And even after that, even when Galba is told, oh, but they weren't attacking you, they were coming forward to greet you, even before that, Galba refuses to consider the possibility of enrolling them into the army until they've been through a formal decimation where lots are drawn and every 10th man must be beaten to death by his comrades. His entry into Rome is inauspicious, and I suppose he passes through streets that are running with blood. Then, once he's in Rome and he's been acclaimed properly by the Senate and escorted to the imperial palace, he sits down and does almost nothing. His first serious problem is finance. And let me go to this slide at the end. Oops. Yes, the finance. Remember, the empire is fighting a big war in the eastern Mediterranean. Nero has been extravagant with money and unable to raise as much as is needed. Here we have a passage from Tacitus, which is something I think on which we can rely. The next anxiety was with regard to finances. After full consideration, it seemed fairest to look for money from the sources where the cause of the poverty lay. 2,200 million sesterces had been squandered by Nero in gifts. It was voted that individuals should be summoned and that a 10th part of the gifts which Nero had made to them should be left with each. but Nero's favourites had hardly 1/10 left, for they had wasted the money of others on the same extravagances as they had their own. The most greedy and depraved had neither lands nor principal, but only what would minister to their vices. 30 Roman knights were appointed to collect the money. This was a new office, and a burden because of the number and intrigue of its members. Everywhere there were auctions and speculators, and the city was disturbed by lawsuits, and yet there was great joy that those who had received gifts from Nero were going to be as poor as those from whom he had taken the money. It's very easy to hand out large amounts of money to your various dependents, to your various hangers-on, but getting the money back afterwards is very difficult, and this is what Galba finds. The treasury is empty. There are continuing demands on the treasury for the pay of the soldiers in the eastern Mediterranean who are besieging Jerusalem, and there is no money. Perhaps taxes can be increased, but you need to decide which taxes should be increased and how they're to be collected. There is a lot of work to be done, and Galba's only idea in the short term is to try to recover some of the money which had been handed out by Nero to his own parasites. But these people themselves have wasted the money, and it's impossible to recover the money. So there is the first difficulty. The second difficulty is that a third of the Roman army, or probably most of the Roman army that has not been drafted into Palestine, a large part of the Roman army, the largest Roman army in the West, is guarding the Rhine frontiers. These people don't like Galba. They have a long-standing grievance against him. They put up, in January 69, they put up Aulus Vitellius as their candidate for emperor. Vitalius accepts it and begins to march on Rome. Galba's response is to adopt Piso as his heir. This outrages Marcus Salvius Otho, who rather fancied himself as Galba's successor, and because he had rendered Galba a number of important services in Spain, he believed that he had a very good claim on the succession. So Otho gets a conspiracy together, and on the 15th of January, Galba and Piso are murdered in the Forum. So that's the end of the first emperor, Galba. Tacitus says about him, one of the most famous quotations from Tacitus, he seemed too great to be a subject, so long as he was a subject, and all would have agreed that he was equal to the imperial office, if only he had never held it. Which seems to be very fair. If you look at Galba's career before 68 AD, it is one of solid and respectable service to the empire. If you look at his performance as emperor, it is, at the very least, a disappointment. Maybe he was old, maybe he was too old and too sick for the job, but that's the end of Galba. Next one, Marcus Salvius Otho, a much younger man, late 30s. He's born into a rich but undistinguished family. He can't claim a string of ancestors with triumphs and consulships and all the rest. He also can't claim any particular relationship to the imperial family. But he was a close friend of Nero, and he was the of Poppaea, who was Nero's last wife. Was she his last wife? His next to last wife. It doesn't matter. The one who died in miscarriage, possibly after he'd kicked her in the stomach. He was married to Poppaea. He was forced to divorce her so that Nero could marry her. As a consolation, which got him out of Rome and therefore saved his life, he was sent off as a governor in Spain, where he seems to have done a thoroughly respectable job. However, he has a grudge against Nero because he was in love with his wife and he didn't like divorcing her, and he certainly wasn't happy when the word came back that Nero had kicked her and therefore contributed to her death. So when Galba puts himself up as emperor, Otho supports him, and the clear implied deal at least, is that Otho gives Galba all necessary support and Otho becomes the designated successor. That doesn't quite work out, but Otho does become emperor on the 15th of January 69. His first action is to rehabilitate Nero. Galba had taken a rather hard line against Nero, particularly on account of his leaving the empire bankrupt. But Otho takes a more generous view of Nero's reign and has him rehabilitated. He also marries Sporus. Remember Sporus, the boy or the young man whom Nero had castrated so he could marry him. Well, it seems that he and Otho were good friends, and so Otho married him. Otho was popular with the people and the Senate. Although many people saw him as a continuation of Nero, that does not seem at the time to have been regarded as a fatal impediment. Indeed, it may have made him all the more popular with the people. He was also, unlike Nero, certainly Nero towards the end, notable for his moderation and clemency. However, Vitalius, the commander of the armies on the Rhine, he's gone too far to pull back, and although Otho tries to make peace with him, although he tries to suggest, well, look, I'll marry your daughter, and so you can be associated in the empire with me, Vitalius is not willing to listen to any kind of compromise talk, and he invades Italy. Otho wins a number of small engagements, but then at Bedriacum in northern Italy, there is a main engagement where Otho's forces are decisively crushed by Vitellius. These are battle-hardened veterans from the Rhine. They will just go through the Praetorian Guard like a hot knife through butter. It's not the end, because Otho still controls the seas, he still has the navy, and there is the strong possibility that he can bring in soldiers from Spain and various other parts of the empire. But either Otho loses heart, or he decides that he does not really want to plunge the Roman world into a great civil war like the one between Antony and Octavian, or more likely, like the one between Caesar and Pompey. So rather than preside over a devastating civil war, Otho commits suicide. There are some strange stories told about his suicide. Apparently many of his soldiers were so upset, so overcome by his suicide, that they committed suicide in sympathy. And there are stories of how, when the news of his suicide was announced to some of the more distant soldiers in his army, they were so overcome with grief and horror that they attacked each other and fought to the death. I don't know what to say about that. There is a representation of Otho, and again, he probably didn't look like that. He probably looked a little more like that than Galba looked like the representations of him. Otho might have turned out to be a thoroughly decent emperor, but you can't tell. He's a bit like Britannicus. Britannicus has always had the reputation for being a decent boy. It's a shame that he was murdered by Nero. It would have been so much better for the Roman world if he had become the emperor. But I suspect that there is a degree of bias in this. Anyone called Britannicus obviously has a good reputation in England, and we don't know. Britannicus may have been another Caligula for all we can say. And Otho might have been completely useless. He had come to power by rather dubious means. Anyway, let's pass on to the next one in the sequence, and this is Aulus Vitellius. I suppose the bust tells you everything you need to know about him. There is nothing wrong with being rather stout. It is a curse against which I have fought all my life. But it's not a curse against which Vitellius seems to have fought in any degree. undistinguished family, a rather undistinguished career. He first comes to prominence as one of the young protégés, you could call him, of Tiberius on Capri, not a place where you would send a young man for his moral improvement, perhaps. Again, we don't know what happened on Capri, but it probably wasn't a monastery there. On Capri, he became close friends with Caligula, and he did well during the reign of Caligula, which probably tells you something about Vitalius. He then continued to do well during the reign of Claudius, and it seems that he found favour with Claudius because they both had a passion for playing dice. By 68, Vitalius is in his mid-50s. That means that he's decidedly over the hill. He is into what used to be called the decline of life. But after Nero's death, as soon as Galba turns up, Vitalius is packed off to be head of the armies on the Rhine. Apparently, Galba sent him off to be commander-in-chief there because he regarded Vitalius as a man without abilities and without ambition who would be no trouble. He said that Vitalius was so notoriously idle and gluttonous that he would not be able to lead any kind of revolt against Galba, which was a serious miscalculation. Even before Galba is murdered by Otho, Vitalius has managed to get the legions on the Rhine to acclaim him as emperor. He's done so by outright bribery and also other kinds of corruption of the men. Just because Galba has been murdered and Otho is the emperor is no reason for Vitalius to step down and say, oh, well, I now accept Otho as the emperor. No, he begins a march on Rome, and we've got to the point where he reaches northern Italy, defeats Otho's army. Otho commits suicide. Vitalius is then acclaimed, or he's accepted as emperor by the Senate in April 69. Vitalius also continues the rehabilitation of Nero, but he also decides to settle a few scores, or to settle a large number of scores. One of the first scores he wants to settle is the public humiliation and death of young Sporus. He arranges a theatrical representation in which Sporus will be gang raped and strangled in front of the Roman people. Apparently Sporus committed suicide in order to avoid that degree of humiliation. That is the first and perhaps the most grotesque of the crimes that Vitalius commits. He rules as a tyrant during his brief reign. You can often justify when an emperor rules tyrannically. Remember that the empire is fighting a first-class war in the eastern Mediterranean. The imperial treasury is absolutely empty, and there's no way of filling it in the short term through regular taxation. And you have this gigantically rich senatorial class in Rome, so rich that it's impossible to resist the temptation. If the American government were to round up Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, and all the 50 or 100 richest men in the country and put them to death and confiscate their fortunes, it would probably pay the expenses of the American federal state for a few months at the absolute most. It's hardly worth doing. There's no point confiscating the wealth of the rich because it's not enough. There's not a very great gulf in our world between rich and poor. You may think there's an enormous gulf between us and Jeff Bezos with his $100 or $200 billion, but it still doesn't approximate the kind of gulf that existed in the empire between the very rich and most other people. If you were to lay hands on a few dozen of the richest members of the Senate, you could run the empire for several years on the proceeds of the confiscations. And when you have that kind of social structure, it means that the members of the senatorial aristocracy were rather like trees in a forest. They are there to be chopped down and made into a fleet as and when may be required. Many of the bad things said about Vitalius are probably true, but they may be explicable on grounds other than personal sadism and greed. But there's no doubt that he also was sadistic and greedy. Sutonius. He delighted in inflicting death and torture on anyone whatsoever and for any cause whatever, putting to death several men of rank, fellow students and comrades of his, whom he had solicited to come to court by every kind of deception, all but offering them a share in the rule. This he did in various treacherous ways, even giving poison to one of them with his own hand in a glass of cold water, for which the man had called when ill of a fever. Besides, he spared hardly one of the moneylenders, contractors, and tax-gatherers who had ever demanded of him the payment of a debt at Rome or of a toll on a journey. When one of these had been handed over for execution just as he was paying his morning call, and at once recalled, as all were praising the emperor's mercy, Vitalius gave orders to have him killed in his presence, saying that he wished to feast his eyes. In another case he had two sons who attempted to intercede for their father, put to death with him. Again, Sutonius, but his besetting sins were luxury and cruelty. He divided his feasts into 3, sometimes into 4 a day, breakfast, lunch and dinner and a drinking bout, and he was readily able to do justice to all of them through his habit of taking emetics. He's described as having a large stomach, let's put it that way. And here is a representation of him, and here is a representation probably of the same bust in the late 17th century. There's a young boy whose job is to produce a sketch of Vitalius. He is a most unpleasant man who is hated and feared by the senatorial nobles, and he is increasingly hated by the Roman people. What happens next? This man, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, 9 to 79 AD. Another man born into an undistinguished family, but he has a solid military career under Claudius, taking part in the conquest of Britain. He was favoured by Nero until he fell asleep at one of Nero's musical performances. In 66 AD, sent east to suppress the Jewish revolt, an efficient campaign with small, indeed in the early days with insufficient forces, but he still manages to break the main military thrust of the Jewish revolt, and after that it's a matter of laying siege to various holdouts, Jerusalem, Masada, and so on. The Jewish revolt is not suppressed by Vespasian, but it is broken. It's then prolonged by desperate resistance. In July 69, Vespasian is acclaimed emperor by the armies and by the administration of the East. He leaves the siege of Jerusalem in the hands of his son Titus, and with a small force arrives in Alexandria, where the man in charge, the prefect of Egypt, the man appointed directly by the emperor, is a Hellenized Jew called Alexander, who welcomes Vespasian and has him acclaimed as Pharaoh of Egypt. The importance of arriving in Alexandria is that Vespasian is now in charge of the grain supply to Rome, and so can switch off and switch on the grain shipments to Rome as and when he wishes, which gives him a great deal of leverage in Rome and in the Senate. Vespasian doesn't do much in the way of military action to make good his claim, This is arranged in Rome by his son Domitian, who is there, and by various other supporters. There is vicious street fighting in Rome, in which apparently 50,000 people died. At the end of that, Vespasian was declared emperor. He's appointed emperor on the 15th of December 69, but he doesn't arrive in Rome until the middle of 70 AD. And this is the end of the year of the four emperors. It is a return to political stability that lasts for another 111 years, until the accession of Commodus in 180 AD. But let's go back and see what happens to Vitalius. It's a most unpleasant end. According to Sutonius, they, that is the army of Vespasian, they dragged Vitalius from his hiding place, and when they asked him his name, for they did not know him, and if he knew where Vitalius was, he attempted to escape them by a lie. Being soon recognised, he did not cease to beg that he be confined for a time, even in the prison, alleging that he had something to say of importance to the safety of Vespasian. But they bound his arms behind his back, put a noose about his neck, and dragged him with rent garments and half naked to the forum. All along the sacred way he was greeted with mockery and abuse, his head held back by the hair, as is common with criminals, and even the point of a sword placed under his chin, so that he could not look down but must let his face be seen. Some pelted him with dung and ordure, others called him incendiary and glutton, and some of the mob even taunted him with his bodily defects. He was in fact abnormally tall, with a face usually flushed from hard drinking, a huge belly, and one thigh crippled from being struck once upon a time by a 4-horse chariot when he was in attendance on Gaius, i.e. Caligula, as he was driving. At last, on the stairs of wailing, he was tortured for a long time and then dispatched and dragged off with a hook to the Tiber. There is a representation from the 19th century of the end of Vitalius as he's being dragged around with a hook and he's being dispatched. Tacitus tells a very similar story. Vitalius was forced at the point of the sword now to lift his face and offer it to his captor's insults, now to see his own statues falling, and to look again and again on the rostra, or the place where Galba had been killed. Finally the soldiers drove him to the Gemonian stairs, where the body of Flavius Sabinus had recently been lying. His only utterance marked his spirit as not ignoble, for when the tribune insulted him, he replied, "Yet I was your emperor." Then he fell under a shower of blows, and the people attacked his body after he was dead with the same base spirit with which they had fawned on him while he lived. So you have two accounts, one by Sutonius, one of Tacitus, of the death of Vitalius, and these accounts are probably based on eyewitness accounts because these men were writing 50 or 60 years after the event. Of course, there is a degree of potential bias there because the Flavians, the house of Vespasian, had no particular interest in marking out any of these three interim emperors as other than wastrels and tyrants, but I'm willing to accept most of the things said about these men. So that is the end of the period of instability. Vespasian has made good his claim to be the emperor. He has entered into Rome in triumph, and during the next 10 years he works tremendously hard and he re-establishes political stability. Here are some stories about him from Sutonius. The only thing for which he can be fairly censured was his love of money, for not content with reviving the imposts which had been repealed under Galba, he added new and heavy burdens, increasing the amount of tribute paid by the provinces, in some cases actually doubling it, and quite openly carrying on traffic which would be shameful even for a man in private life, for he would buy up certain commodities merely in order to distribute them at a profit. He made no bones of selling offices to candidates and acquittals to men under prosecution, whether innocent or guilty. He is even believed to have had the habit of designedly advancing the most rapacious of his procurators to higher posts, that they might be richer when he later condemned them. In fact, it was common talk that he had used these men as sponges, because he, so to speak, soaked them when they were dry and squeezed them out when they were wet. Others, on the contrary, believe that he was driven by necessity to raise money by spoliation and robbery because of the desperate state of the treasury and the privy purse, to which he bore witness at the very beginning of his reign by declaring that 40,000 millions were needed to set the state upright. This latter view seems the more probable, since he made the best use of his gains, ill-gotten though they were. Then there's an entertaining story. When Titus found fault with him, that's his son, when Titus found fault with him for contriving a tax upon public conveniences, he held a piece of money from the first payment to his son's nose, asking whether its odour was offensive to him. When Titus said, "No," he replied, "Yet it comes from urine." On the report of a deputation that a colossal statue of great cost had been voted him at public expense, he demanded to have it set up at once, and holding out his open hand said that the base was ready. Sutonius is filled with stories about the meanness, the avarice, and the higher taxes in the reign of Vespasian. However, he ended the fiscal crisis. The Jewish war was finished, the legions were marched through Rome in triumph, and the empire went back onto a peace footing, and there is no further talk in the histories that we have of a serious financial embarrassment for the imperial state until maybe 150 years later, during the reign of Septimius Severus. Vespasian stabilized the imperial treasury, and that is the end of the political instability. What else can we say about this revolution? Because this is what we've had. The revolution is this. When the empire was dominated by the Julio-Claudian house, the men who cooperated with the emperors in ruling the empire were overwhelmingly men from the traditional senatorial nobility, men who, like the Julians and the Claudians, could trace their bloodlines deep back into Roman history and who had been greatly enriched in the aftermath of the Second Punic War. So the early emperors shared the government of the empire with the men who most regretted the loss of the Republic. There was also a growing bureaucracy made up of slaves and freedmen, but overwhelmingly the main jobs in the administration were given to members of the old nobility. One of the most interesting innovations of Vitalius, and he was not a man notable for solid innovations, but one of his most notable innovations was to throw open membership of the bureaucracy to members of the equestrian class, that is, of what I suppose we would once have called the gentry, people in the upper middle class who are not quite rich enough, not quite grand enough to be regarded as members of the nobility or the aristocracy, but who are themselves respectably wealthy. This continued. This was never reversed by Vespasian, and it continued through the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, until by the end of the century, the government of the empire had fallen entirely into the hands of the Italian and Spanish upper middle class, if you can allow the use of that term for the Roman Empire. The old nobility, these people did not entirely die out, but they had very largely become extinct. They continue to exist, and of course the upstart ruling class made sure to marry into the remnants of that older ruling class. But the end of Nero's reign also marks the end of the domination of the small group of families which had emerged to wealth and power in the 2nd century BC, which had fought in the 1st century BC over the future, or just over the domination of the Republic, and who had, even as they despised the emperors and even as they plotted against the emperors, cooperated with the emperors in the government of the empire. Their time came to an end with the death of Nero. It may have been hastened by Nero's purges towards the end, but it came to an end in 68 AD. You then have a period of turbulence, just a year, fortunately for the Romans, but a period of turbulence before the beginning of a new order of things. Vespasian and his sons, they were men who had come from nowhere. They couldn't point to a 500-year history of service to the state. And that is what you get from 69 AD. A transfer of power from one class to another class, and what you see emerging very rapidly after 69 AD is a new kind of empire, and until the return of troubles after 180 AD, maybe after 198 AD, maybe after 212 AD, hard to say. But what you have is the emergence of a new kind of empire ruled by a new kind of ruling class, which is determined to maintain political stability and at least the facade of constitutional respectability. That's not the end, of course, because we have one more session, and I need to talk at some length about the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. And although for a long time, starting with his death, starting with his murder indeed, although for a long time Domitian had a bad reputation, he has in the past century been rehabilitated. And there is reason to suppose that he was one of the better emperors, so long as you didn't get on his bad side. But that's another matter. Any questions or comments arising from that?